What is up, Who Dat Nation? Welcome back inside another edition of the Straight Up Saints podcast. It's your host, Chris Rosevoglu, and we got a decent amount to talk about today with Saints mandatory minicamp coming to a close. Some good news, some bad news, a couple of signings we'll talk about, a coach being let go, and also discuss the outlook of one Juwan Johnson, who I truly believe can become one of those emerging tight ends that may be top 5, top 7, if he takes another step, but we'll talk about whether or not he'll do that. But before that, I want to remind you, as always, that this program is brought to you by Scott McNair Injury Lawyers. And if you've been injured in any kind of accident, car, truck, 18-wheeler, or hurt offshore, just know that Scott McNair handles it all. You can give him a call at 504-500-1111 for a free consultation. They'll always fight for the win. So let's start off with the main one. I see you guys asking in the chat, and we'll get to it. So the not so great news of this Thursday is that it comes out that Chris Olave, second-year receiver from Ohio State, is dealing with what is called the minor injury at the time, but the actual injury itself is somewhat alarming when you hear it, and it's Achilles inflammation. That's what was told today. Nick Underhill talked about it. John Hendricks talked about it. A couple other Saints reporters mentioned it as well. So Achilles inflammation, considered minor, but he did not practice because of it. So my initial thoughts, the fact that it's being labeled minor, okay, great. Dennis Allen says it's not that serious. Again, ideal. But you never want to hear the Achilles brought up into it because that's an injury that could linger. Obviously, it's one of those serious type of injuries in the sense that if something were to happen of a major degree, that hurts your explosiveness. Obviously, that can not just affect you this year, but years to come. So obviously, the hope here is that Chris Olave is fine moving forward. But he did not practice. He watched the practice from afar, but that's the main concern right now. The good news, though, if it's not minor, and if Dennis Allen isn't leading us on into believing that everything's okay, and everything actually is okay for Chris Olave, he's got over a month to be ready for training camp. And if you kind of read between the lines, Dennis Allen said that he expects everyone to be ready for training camp except for one player who he didn't want to mention who. And he's not saying they won't be ready. He's just not ready to commit 100% to saying they will be ready. And if I'm going to read between the lines, and this could just be me speculating at the moment, I think your only two options really are Chris Olave or Michael Thomas. And it's not going to be both of them. It would be one of them. And my gut tells me that it more likely be Michael Thomas, who said he wants to be a full go, but you don't know if he will, rather than Olave. So I am going to, in this moment, maybe naively, believe that it isn't serious and that Chris Olave will be okay. But make no mistake about it, just the word Achilles scares the living hell out of me. And I'm just going to be honest about it, right? If it were a groin strain or a hamstring strain, it still isn't ideal. It'll still be considered minor. But something about the Achilles is just like you hear it and you start to kind of get up in his shell and get a little nervous about it. So hopefully Chris Olave is okay, because I do think that this is the type of guy that, if he is healthy this year, monster numbers. I truly believe he can do that. I think that we're looking at a player that, if healthy, I'd say 1,300 yards receiving is kind of what would be my guess for this upcoming season. But like you guys said, hopefully he's fine. We'll keep our fingers crossed that he is okay. And as for Mike, I'm not too worried. Mike was working this week, mostly off to the side, whether it's getting mental reps, kind of getting his feet underneath him and getting used to cutting out there again. Mike is doing exactly what you want. And I'm going to be honest with you guys. I didn't even know if Mike was going to be out there for mandatory minicamp, but the fact that he did make that appearance at OTAs the last week and then was out for all of mandatory minicamp working out there, I feel good about where Mike's at too. Now, I'm not just like DA. No one's commenting or ready to guarantee he'll be ready for training camp, but this is a good sign. Absolutely a good sign. But that's what we want to start off with, talking about Chris Olave and what's going to happen there. But again, Achilles inflammation, it's labeled not serious, but I'm going to be just a little concerned until we see number 12 back out there, because Achilles injuries scare the living hell out of me. Now, let's talk about some Saints roster moves, because they actually made a couple today, mostly at the receiver position. So they bring in Lynn Bowden Jr., former Kentucky star, and Kiki QT, who played for Texas Tech, started with the Texans, then played with the Colts. They bring in these two receivers. Who do they get rid of? They get rid of offensive lineman Yasir Durant. They get rid of Malik Flowers, undrafted rookie wide receiver, and Roderick Thompson, a running back from Texas Tech. So bringing in the two wide receivers I thought was pretty interesting. Lynn Bowden Jr. is one of those type of players who, for me, 2019 season at Kentucky, just electric. That's the only word I'm going to use, right? Because this is a wide receiver who got thrusted into the quarterback position because of injuries. And they basically kind of, if you ever wanted to imagine what a season of Taysom Hill doing everything would look like, it'd probably be what Lynn did at Kentucky in 2019. The downside is gets drafted by the Raiders third round, doesn't really do much there, doesn't do much in Miami. I think New England stint doesn't nothing much there. It's been tough to find that role in the NFL, and I think the Saints is a hard spot because the Saints already got a guy like that who has proven that he can do this in the NFL, play wide receiver, play tight end, play quarterback, run out of the backfield, play special teams. So I do think Lynn will be behind the eight ball in terms of where does he fit? But I like the idea of bringing in another intriguing weapon in him. The Kiki QT move actually to me is way more intriguing, and it doesn't have to do with him being a receiver, although he does have almost 1,000 career receiving yards, and he did have moments with Deshaun Watson Houston that he looked good. To me, I actually wonder if he can compete for a spot on special teams maybe as a punt returner. 17 punts last year, returned for 152 yards. That doesn't exactly, jump off the page to you. But I'll tell you why it's interesting. I am of the belief when you have a guy like a Rashid Shaheed who you think is uber talented and can take that next step at receiver, I get a little nervous about him on special teams because I always think to myself, well, what if a player like him gets hurt on a return? Then you feel like you wasted an electric wide receiver on special teams. And that is the one unit in the NFL that is unquestionably dying, for better or worse. It's just not what it used to be. So where do Rashid Shaheed last year and Kiki QT last year stack up punt return wise? It's actually pretty close. So Rashid Shaheed last year averaged 9.7 yards per return. Kiki QT on the Colts averaged 8.9 yards per return. So they're 0.8 apart. It's not that big of a difference. He does have experience actually as a decent slot receiver in Houston. I'm not going to go ahead and say he makes the roster because Lord knows this wide receiver depth chart for the first time in a long time is stacked. But I kind of like the idea of bringing in another punt returner and seeing, because one of my fears is like, what if Rashid Shaheed does get banged up on punt returns? It was kind of the double-edged sword of Deontay Hardy being a good return man, but also an intriguing receiver, right? Because we knew as a return man, he was all pro. But we also saw glimpses when Deontay was in New Orleans where we're like, okay, he could be a really good speed receiver. And you never found that balance. And a lot of it is because you take a punishment on special teams. So I'm curious to see how this goes. This could just be a depth signing. But the one thing I want to say about bringing in Kiki QT and bringing in Lynn Bowden Jr., I think the Saints have done a phenomenal job this offseason of making sure the wide receiver room is never where it was at the last couple of years again. Because forget about these two guys for a second who you bring in, and both of them are former college stars, and they do have talent, and they're still in the prime of their careers in terms of if they're going to get it going. The Saints have Michael Thomas. The Saints have Olave. They have Shaheed. They have James Washington. They have Traquan Smith. They have A.T. Perry. They also brought in, Kirk Merritt and Keith Kirkwood, keeping them around. So they have that talent. They brought in Brian Edwards from Vegas. So the Saints have done a good job of stacking that wide receiver room. And I hope that bringing in guys like this just continues that idea of iron sharpening iron, making sure the best men win the jobs in camp. So I'm excited for the camp jobs, who wins those battles. And again, we'll see, but maybe Kiki ends up being a punt return guy for the Saints. And if not, all right, you tried. It's worth bringing in a flyer on a guy like that. Now, before I get into Juwan Johnson, his outlook, and pull up some questions or comments that you guys brought in the chat, which I definitely will bring up in just a moment, just want to remind you that we're also brought to you by Ladder and Bloom. And if you want to speak with Chris Smith of Ladder and Bloom to talk about a free marketing valuation of your property, to book a property tour, or to just talk real estate, you can give him a call at 504-231-2004. So I said the Saints were busy today on this Thursday. It wasn't just roster moves. They also decided to make a move with the coaching staff. Assistant DB coach Sterling Moore let go, no longer with the Saints. Remember, Sterling played with the Saints back when the defenses used to be putrid, and he was brought to the staff in 2022. Now, the reason for his departure, unknown at the moment, but who knows? Remember, the Saints brought in Joe Woods to be the new defensive coordinator, and if there's one thing Saints fans will not deny about Joe Woods is he knows his DBs. Did it with Cleveland, did it in Denver when they won the Super Bowl in 2015. So who knows? I'm not totally worried because I think that Joe Woods will have that down. I also think it's a talented group. And I'm actually going to talk about it on Monday's show. Remember, we're always doing now Monday live streams on Boo Crew Media's YouTube page. I think that Joe Woods is going to do a great job. And I actually think that the cornerback room can be top 5, top 3 in the league next year. I think there's a battle brewing between Adebo and Alontae Taylor in a good way. So yeah, we'll see how this develops. But the Saints have not been afraid to make changes at the coaching staff. And for fans who are nervous about it, just remember, if they ran the entire operation back like they did last year, a lot of us would have been like, okay, I don't know if I trust them. So at least they're willing to make changes. And I think when the Saints make these changes, if it doesn't work, you can live with the results because you knew they at least tried. If they ran the whole thing back again, there's a little bit of laziness to it. So I'm okay with the move. We'll see what goes down. Now, before I close things off with talking about Juwan Johnson and his outlook for 2023, I'll bring up any comments that you guys have here in the chat. First one, we just picked up Bowden and other guys, so we have some backup. They actually absolutely do. I see a little Kiki, do you love me? Are you riding joke? I'm sure Saints fans will bring that up if he makes the roster. I know I'll bring it up. You guys know I'm a corny guy. So if there is a joke to be made during the season, if Kiki QT makes the roster, we will be having those jokes. But for now, nothing much there. Any update on Hunter Renfrow? None at the moment. But since we're in the mood to speculate on this Thursday, I think it's David Carr's Kids Podcast Network put out a Hunter Renfrow highlight reel today. I'm not saying that means anything, but I'm going to say the flirtation going on between Carr and Renfrow is potent. And maybe you'll stop, but you have this dead period between now and training camp. And I think if you're New Orleans, you probably call the Raiders maybe a couple times and be like, hey, what do you want for Renfrow? What is your asking price? Has it lowered? What kind of deal can we make? And you keep calling because I think Hunter Renfrow, you put him on the Saints, A, you have no more concerns about the slot receiver position. But B, you assemble a wide receiver room that can withstand a major injury. And I think right now, I love this receiver room, but there will be some hesitancy to how much do you love them if one of the main guys goes down. And I think if you add Hunter Renfrow, your main 4 is so dynamic that you feel like you can withstand one major injury. So I would like to see Renfrow brought into New Orleans. At the moment, there is nothing of significance being talked about, though. But I think when there's smoke, this much smoke around a situation like this, there is fire. And I do think that Vegas right now is probably just keeping their ground and holding their ground firm because they haven't gotten what they want. But teams budge. The Jacoby Myers move was a signaling of, Josh McDaniels ready to bring in his guys and change it up offensively. So we'll see what happens. But no update on Renfrow at the moment. I just think that the flirting, though, between the Carr family and Renfrow, it has not stopped, and I don't know if it will. So we'll kind of see if that means something or nothing. Another question here. Could we see a Quan reunion for linebacker depth? I'm going to guess no, but this is another position during this kind of dead period that the Saints have to make a decision. You know what you have in Pete and DeMario. You've had about 4 weeks now of practice to see what you got in DeMarco Jackson and Zach Bond. If you feel comfortable with their improvements and their development, I don't know if you have to make a move. If you don't feel comfortable, you look at that linebacker roster, you look at the free agents, and you say, okay, which one do you want? Is it Quan? Is it Zach Cunningham? Is it John Bostic? Is it Deion Jones? Whoever it may be, understand you're not getting a guy that's going to just bolster the unit to a ridiculous degree, but you're adding in a guy that you feel comfortable to pick up the playbook, know his role, and maybe if his number's called, make a couple plays here and there. But they got to be an off-ball linebacker because I think that's the one thing the Saints want to see from DeMarco and Zach Bond. Because if they saw it already, great. But I don't think they have yet and they haven't shown it. That's also a reason why we haven't seen Zach Bond play much. So if I'm going to guess, I think the Saints kind of like what DeMarco Jackson's doing. And I think DeMarco Jackson is the best bet out of him and Bond to kind of get something going. But if they're not confident in it, yes, I do expect them to look at linebackers if that's the case. I just don't know if they go for a Quan reunion because my rebuttal would be if they know they don't have it, why not do it already and bring him in since he knows the system? But again, that's neither here nor there, and we'll see how this all goes. So let's go into Juwan Johnson as we wrap it up here on the Straight Up Saints podcast. And I'm just going to put it simple. Will Juwan Johnson become a star this year? Now, some people might think the word star is way too bold, way too heavy, but I think we have to look at his numbers in 2021, what he did in 2022, and ask ourselves if he has another jump in him. So he went from 13 catches to 42 catches, 159 yards to 508 yards, and 4 touchdowns to 7 touchdowns. And that was with subpar quarterback play. And remember, this was a guy at Penn State and at Oregon who was a wide receiver, makes the transition to tight end. Now, what do we know about Derek Carr? He utilizes the tight end position fairly well because Darren Waller, in his first full year with Derek Carr, had 90 catches for over 1,100 yards and 3 touchdowns. And for people to say, well, don't expect Juwan Johnson to become Darren Waller, I'm not saying he will. But what I'm telling you is that Darren Waller, before he had that first full year with Derek Carr and the Raiders, and I know that Darren Waller, his story and his comeback and just being able to overcome what he did off the field is fantastic. This was a player who had only 178 career yards before 2019. So before 2019, no one really knew of him. And then in that first year with Derek Carr, he became a household name. And for people thinking, he had some down seasons in Vegas after 2019, his numbers only look mediocre post 2020 because he's been hurt the last 2 seasons. But 2019 and 2020, what he did fully healthy was phenomenal. 1,100 yards in both seasons. In 2020, he had 107 catches. He had 9 touchdowns that year. We're talking about a guy that was a Pro Bowl tight end in 2020. And Saints know well on Monday night, he shredded them in that Week 2 game. So I'm not saying Juwan Johnson is becoming Darren Waller 2.0. What I'm telling you, though, is Derek Carr likes to utilize the tight end position. Juwan Johnson showed you that he could kick it into another gear. And Juwan Johnson, that 6'4", 230, still extremely young in his career, why can't he take one more step? He already took a gigantic leap. If he even takes a leap that is half of what he took last year, we're looking at a tight end that catches, 55 passes for 700 yards? That would be a damn good season if that happens. And the Saints' contract for Juwan Johnson kind of tells you that they don't think last year was a fluke. Now, does it tell you that they think he's going to be even better? Maybe not, because 2-year, $12 million is in the Dalton Schultz range. But if you tell me he's going to be doing what Dalton Schultz has done for the last 2-3 years, you're going to take that in a heartbeat. And I think that 2-year, $12 million contract is telling you that because the Saints are paying him for what he just did, but they're also leaving the door open that if he plays great next year, that second year is going to be a bargain contract-wise, but it also opens the door for them to retalk and enter negotiations for a new contract where he can cash in. So I think Juwan's going to improve. I don't know how much the scale will be, but Juwan Johnson was one of the only guys that when the Saints were having an abysmal showing offensively, he would show up. And like I said, 40-plus catches for 500 yards and 7 touchdowns with mediocre at best, and it wasn't mediocre, it was less than mediocre, quarterback play is really intriguing. So to kind of put that all together, I do believe that Juwan Johnson can become a top 10 tight end by the end of next season. Now, does that make him a star in your book? Probably not. I think the tight end position is one of the weakest ones in the NFL right now. I mean, we look at last year, Kyle Pitts was supposed to be that next guy to join the ranks of the Kelce's, the Kittles, the Wallers, the Mark Andrews, and he didn't do that. He took a massive step back. But I do think if we look at Juwan Johnson's numbers from last year, we look at the year-to-year progression, we look at the fact that he's not going to be the number one guy in this offense. It's either going to be Olave or Michael Thomas or even Alvin. There's going to be a lot of one-on-one opportunities, and I think that's a great opportunity for him to thrive in. So I do feel that Juwan Johnson is in for another good season. And I'll say right now, I think he's going to have 700 yards plus. 700 yards plus, that's where I'm going to put him at. Does that make him a star in your book? No. Does that make him a top 10 tight end in the NFL? It might. Again, weak position. Weak position. So I'm excited to see what Juwan Johnson does, and I'm eager to know what you guys have to think. Do you think Juwan Johnson's going to become a star? Let me know in the comments section below. And as always, guys, make sure to subscribe to Boot Crew Media's YouTube page for more content like this. Pelicans content as well. I know Zion Williamson news is the hottest thing around the block at the moment, so make sure you subscribe and listen to that. Pro Pels Talk had a great show about Zion, Scoot Henderson, everything going on there, so check that out. And as always, guys, make sure to stay tuned for more content here on the Straight Up Saints podcast, the destination for the Who Dat Nation. We will have a live show Monday morning. Make sure to stay tuned for that. We're going to talk about Danielle Hunter. Can the Saints trade for him and add another elite player to their roster? Talk about Alante Taylor and Paulson Debo. I think we got a special battle brewing. We'll talk about a couple more minicamp notes before we kind of enter that relaxation period for the Saints. But that's going to wrap it up for us here. As always, I appreciate you guys tuning into the podcast. I hope you enjoy the rest of your Thursday night. Have a great Friday and an awesome weekend. I'll talk to you folks on Monday.